So I would like to introduce the first moderator of our first research panel, and that's Dr. Alex Klein. Dr. Klein was appointed the Vice President of Scientific Affairs at CurePSP in July of 2015. He earned his PhD from the University of Freiburg. Did I get that right? I hope I remembered that correctly. Very good. Freiburg, Germany, and is the author of several original research papers, reviews, and book chapters. Previous to his appointment at CurePSP, he worked as a scientific officer coordinating European Union neuroscience funding, and so he's brought that great skill to CurePSP, and we're very glad to have Alex here today to kind of translate between the research world and us lay people world. Thanks for coming, Alex.
Good morning. Wow, this is a fantastic, fantastic crowd. Thank you very much, Robin. This is great, and we at CurePSP are really pleased to see how we actually interact and work with the Brain Support Network. Robin has been really fantastic in also advertising and facilitating brain donations, which is, also one of our big goals, and you will also hear from our speakers soon that research needs brain donations. It's really important, and that's also one of the core missions of the Brain Support Network. We have a great list of speakers here for the first panel, and I would like to introduce the first speaker now, Dr. Adam Boxer. This is actually his backyard here, so to speak, and Dr. Boxer is a professor at the Memory and Aging Center here at UCSF in San Francisco, and he will talk about, let me just have a look what you're talking about. You will give an overview about PSP clinical research. Adam.
Thanks, Alex. I wanted to thank Robin and the Brain Support Network for inviting me to speak, and this is really a wonderful event. Also wanted to thank AbbVie and Biogen for helping to support the meeting. So what Robin asked me to do today is to give a brief overview of clinical research for PSP and CBD and other related disorders. And what I want to tell you is that these are really exciting times for us. We've over the past decade, we've really made a lot of progress and now have treatments that are being tested in patients that we really think have the potential to make a difference in people's lives and could even potentially represent a real treatment for these diseases. Now, we don't know for sure whether they work, but they are in clinical trials and they're promising enough that they have a real chance. So this is what we would think of as a real advance in research. Let's see, I guess this doesn't work here. So I just want to give you my disclosure. So most of the research that we do is supported by your tax dollars, by the National Institutes of Health, also by a number of private foundations, including and also the University of California. I do work with companies, and it's important to talk about conflicts of interest. So I'm a physician, I take care of many patients, but I also think it's important for us to develop new therapies. And the pharmaceutical industry has a lot of experience and resources to do this, so we do work with companies to try and bring these therapies to our patients, and we try not to let these decisions to initiate clinical trials influence our day-to-day decision-making in people's care, but it's something important to disclose so that you know that. I want to be transparent about that, and if anyone has concerns, please feel free to ask me about it. So before we talk about any new therapies, I want to just tell you a little bit about some of the advances just over the past year that have been published in PSP research. And while we hope to find a drug that will be the magic bullet that will completely cure all tau-related disease, one thing that was really remarkable to me was a study that was published in the journal PLOS One from a group in Italy that showed that physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, when you really work at them hard in patients with PSP, leads to very significant, small but significant improvements in function. And so while we're looking for the treatment or the drug that's going to cure these diseases, we don't want to ignore what's available already and that we know that helps. And this was a nice proof. I won't take you through all the chart, partially because I think this pointer doesn't work, but basically the effect size is actually the improvements that people saw over a month of intensive rehabilitation therapy was greater than any drug that anyone's ever tried for PSP. So this is really a nice demonstration that while we want to work towards molecular therapies to treat the underlying cause of PSP, CBD, and other disorders, that we shouldn't give up on things that we can do now, and they really do make a difference. So you should have this in your handout, and also there's a paper that hopefully Robin can provide to people that we published a few months ago. Oh, okay. It's at the back of the room at the UCSF table. And this is basically a very complicated picture, sort of showing you all the different molecules that interact with the key protein that we think that causes this disease, which is the tau protein. So this is a neuron here. This is a schematic of a neuron. And if you use a magnifying glass and look inside, there are these tubes called microtubules. And tau are these little green squiggles here, which helps to glue those microtubules together. Now, we don't know why, but in PSP, and PSP and CBD really are the diseases that are most closely linked to abnormalities in this tau protein, but something goes wrong and that leads to disease. But as we've learned more about the biology of this disease over the past few years, we've been able to think of really scientifically designed therapies that could make this tau-related toxicity better. So the first class of therapies actually affect the expression of the gene that leads to this tau protein at the gene expression level. And the second class of therapies that have really been tested the most are chemical. They interfere with the chemical modification, so the chemistry of tau, or they help to stabilize this microtubule, which gives the neuron its structure. The third class of therapies that are now really the most advanced in testing are therapies that block what we think is the spread of abnormal forms of the tau protein from one nerve cell to another nerve cell. So there's the idea that something goes wrong with the tau, it becomes sticky and then spreads to another cell where it sticks to more tau and then causes the disease to spread. And so we think that new types of immune therapies or monoclonal antibodies might actually block this spread. And so I've just circled 4 of the classes of drugs here that are actually have recently been in clinical trials or are currently in clinical trials in patients either with PSP or for this one that affects gene expression is now in an Alzheimer's disease trial, but we hope that soon will come into PSP and related disorders. And so this is a long list, and I apologize about all the technical names here, but just to say we really are testing new therapies that target the tau protein in PSP and related disorders. And it's important to do these studies because the only way we know something works is through a scientific clinical trial. So this is also a plea to everyone here, and I know many people here are participating in research, but one way for you to participate in research and to give back to others in the community is to participate in clinical trials. So we learned that one class of drugs, the first drugs that were tried that stabilize the microtubules, so far they haven't worked. Next week I'll be presenting at a meeting in Boston the results of a trial that was funded by some private foundations, the Tau Consortium, Corticobasal Degeneration Solutions of the third microtubule stabilizing agent, so stay tuned for that. There were some other drugs that affect the chemistry that I showed you of tau. The first ones didn't work, but there are trials underway, including one of the drugs salsalate that we're running at UCSF, both for PSP and for Alzheimer's disease. And if you're interested in participating in those trials, please let us know. There are the antisense oligonucleotides, which affect the expression of tau, and then those immunotherapies. One of the things so we're very focused on the tau protein, but we also don't want to ignore other possibilities for therapies. And one thing that we've learned over the past few years is that there's a very unique sleep problem in people with PSP and CBD. It's very unusual. It's different than Parkinson's disease, different than every other brain disorder. And so using the FTD disorders registry that you'll hear about in a minute from Diana Wheaton, we are starting the first of its kind remote clinical trial of 2 FDA-approved sleep medicines for the sleep problems in PSP. And we know how hard it is for people to travel into our clinic to see us and to do all the different assessments we do. So we think that by using this remote clinical trial technology, this is the wave of the future, because hopefully it'll be easier for people, for patients and their families to participate in clinical research without the burden of all the travel. But we still face some challenges, and this is really what we're most actively working on through the efforts of the NIH-supported work. And so still many patients who come to see us are fairly advanced in their disease, and it may be even a little bit too advanced for us to really have the best hope for therapies to work for these disorders. And so that's one challenge. The other challenge is, another challenge is that not every PSP and CBD patient is the same. People have different symptoms and different rates of progression. And so if we want to know if a drug is working, we need a tool that can measure the effects of the drug in people with different kinds of symptoms. So it's this heterogeneity that we've also been working on to develop methods to develop new therapies. I know people here probably don't feel like PSP is a rare disease, but worldwide it's not as common as some of them as other brain diseases. And as we try to put together large clinical trials to really know for sure whether a drug works, we're a little bit concerned that we don't know of enough patients to do multiple large clinical trials at the same time. And so that's something also that we're working on with our colleagues in Europe and in Asia to really, and also using the registry to really identify more patients and families who might want to participate in research, because that's the only way we will ever know whether these treatments work. And then the last thing is that while we're excited about the drugs that we're testing now and the treatments we have to test, we don't have enough of them. And we really need our scientific colleagues, the pharmaceutical industry, and our colleagues at universities to think of new and creative ways to treat these diseases so that we can do more clinical trials if these first drugs don't work. So right now, and this is a little bit of a technical slide, but I just want to tell you that, so the most common form of PSP that most people recognize with eye movement problems and falls is now called Richardson Syndrome, and because it was named for J.C. Richardson, the first neurologist to describe this disorder. And when someone comes into our clinic and has this, we can be very certain that the underlying disease in their brain is truly PSP, and actually Dennis Dixon, who is a famous neuropathologist at the scientific meeting, confirmed this yesterday for us. And so most of the clinical trials that we do focus on this one form of PSP. But we've learned that there are other forms of PSP that sometimes people begin with something that looks more like Parkinson's disease, or even sometimes people have what looks like corticobasal degeneration, but really what they have underneath all of it is PSP. Other people actually start with language or speech problems or even behavioral problems, and we recognize that all of these different clinical features can be caused by PSP. And so this is the heterogeneity that I've been talking about. And so you see there are different ways that this starts, and often these predate this Richardson syndrome diagnosis. So if we could diagnose people during these stages reliably, this would be a way to intervene earlier with therapies. So this is one of the things we're working on. So this is again from the review article that's at the UCSF table if anyone's interested in reading the details. But what we think is that right now, when we do clinical trials, we do them in patients with Richardson syndrome, which is relatively late in the stage of many people's disease with PSP. But what we're really working on now, and I think we're making progress towards the ability to do this, is to do clinical trials in these other forms of PSP that I just showed you about: speech, language, Parkinsonism. And we think by doing this, number one, we increase the number of people who could potentially benefit from experimental therapy. But number two, in some cases, we'll be able to get people earlier. Now, our ultimate goal, and this is what's being done in Alzheimer's disease, is to really detect people very early. So there are new PSP research criteria that were developed this year where we recognize that some people, their first symptom just might be a single fall or a single episode of blurry vision, and then they have nothing for a year. And so we call this phase of PSP suggestive of PSP. And really what we want to do is to get to the stage where we could do clinical trials with new therapies at this very early stage, or even before people have symptoms. And we now know fairly definitively that there are probably many people walking around with very mild PSP pathology in their brain who have no symptoms yet. And so many of those people will never get sick, but we want to identify who might be at risk for getting sick and then intervene. And this is what we call a prevention trial, where we prevent the onset of disease. So that's where we're headed. I hope when we come back in a few years, we'll be able to tell you that we've made some success in really this earlier intervention for disease. And this is the paper, and again, it's very hard to read from here, but that we just published using from a large international consortium co-sponsored by CurePSP and the Tau Consortium and other organizations that really what we think revolutionized the diagnosis of PSP and will allow us to, number one, recognize these variant syndromes, and also, number two, hopefully diagnose people earlier. And the way we do this, and I'm sorry it's a little probably hard to read in the back, but is now we look at different features of disease in different people, and we can represent people much more accurately. So we look at their eye movement dysfunction, their falls, whether they're moving well or not, but also their behavior, language, and cognitive function. And so by rating people on each of these 4 different domains, we think we can detect PSP earlier and diagnose it better. Through doing this, we now have some research networks that are funded by the NIH. One is called ARTFUL, Advancing Research and Treatment for Frontotemporal Lobar Degeneration. Then another one is focused specifically on PSP called Fortney. And there are now 18 centers around North America where we're recruiting patients to do this research, particularly the ones that are now circled in red are part of this very detailed study of people with PSP and CBD. And so we really think that by doing this, this is going to also help us to do clinical trials because we can detect more people and enroll them in the studies. And so you'll hear also about the research registry from Diana in just a minute that's part of this. And I'm fortunately out of time, but you can see that we've recruited about 900 people in these research studies, so we're very successful and we appreciate everyone who's participating. The goal is to get about 1,500 people, and we're studying people to develop new tools to measure disease progression. These are MRI measures of midbrain atrophy in PSP, and you can see we can measure reliable changes over time, and also in CBD. Richard Sy will be talking about some new kinds of brain scan technology called Tau PET that also will teach us a lot about these diseases and help us to develop new therapies. So I think I'm going to skip the last slide and just there's so many people around the country and around the world who are involved in supporting this research, and I think many people in this room also. And particularly we're very grateful to our patients and to our families for participating in research, also to the NIH and all of our patient advocacy group partners for working with us on this. So thank you.